Let's do it.
Hello, everyone. It's Derek Young here, checking in the clubhouse for a really important conversation that I'm excited about. Make sure you have your mics turned up. Make sure you have your pen and paper. Do you hear me?
Yes, indeed. Well, everybody, this is Jonathan Allen, live and full of life today. All kind of energy. Do you hear me?
Okay. Dana here, present. Do you hear me? Because we're about to get real serious.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. And so excited about it.
Yeah, so you all know the Do You Hear Me podcast with Leadership Brainery. Excited about it. Leadership Brainery is all about creating support, access, and exposure for underrepresented communities. And we are here having a really important conversation today with a very special guest of ours who you will meet in a moment.
Yes, yes. And we are always just super thankful and grateful for everyone who invests in the work that we're doing at Leadership Brainery. And for those of you who do not know, Leadership Brainery is increasing access to master's and doctoral degrees for underrepresented communities. And we are ultimately working to increase then access to management level and leadership roles in the workforce as a pathway to closing wealth gaps and opportunity gaps. And we're so grateful for the individuals as well as the companies, the institutions that invest in our work to make it possible. And so today we will highlight one of our sponsors, one of our partners, in fact, State Street Corporation, again, who we are so grateful for, who is one of our leading partners here at Leadership Brainery. So shout out to State Street and all of you who are looking and trying to learn more about ways in which you can level up yourselves financially, generating wealth. Learn more about State Street and the services that they have to offer and see if they're a good fit for you or not. But want to also, if you're looking for a job, consider State Street as a potential employer as well. So thank you, State Street.
Yes,
definitely.
yes, indeed. Dana, who we got with us today?
Okay, well, I feel so honored to have you here. Since the day that I have started, you've been so intentional and gentle about procuring and just guiding the Leadership Brainery mission. Before I even got here, I want to say, and I think that's why you're so special to everyone. So I would love to introduce Catherine Wong and give you the moment to introduce yourself and all that you've done and contributed to this world. Yes, thank you for being here.
Yes.
You're welcome. I'm just thrilled to be here. And instead of reading bio or going through a list of who I am, I first just want to talk about my connection to the Leadership Brainery. That I met Derek in 2018 when I was at Boston College being the director of urban outreach initiatives. He came and did our college career roundtable, where instead of talking behind tables, we had our young people at roundtables with questions, engaging those who were working in all kinds of different careers. And it was the first time that I had the privilege to learn about the work of the Leadership Brainery. It was in due part to my graduate assistant, Alexis Briggs, who invited and researched and found the Brainery and is now herself, as a woman of color, getting her PhD.
Yes.
So very, very excited about it.
Okay.
Do you hear me?
Can you hear me? And then the following year, I came to the LB Summit and at Harvard Law School, and I met Jonathan and just was so excited about this idea of how do we prepare our young people, our BIPOC, those who've been minoritized and marginalized, to go through grad school versus just get in. And I remember saying to Derek at the summit, how, in what ways can I become more involved as you plan, as you think through, having not sort of an idea in mind, but just being very drawn to the charisma, to the energy. And I was able to actually meet the ambassadors at that summit and meet the young people and hear why them going to grad school was so important to them. And then, fast forward to 2020, Jonathan Zoomed me and asked, could we have a conversation? And I was at the crossroads of trying to figure out my next move career-wise. So much was going on in the summer of 2020. around racial injustice, around the pandemic. And Jonathan and I started a conversation about increasing my involvement with the Brainery. And through that, the Director of Equity Implementation position was birthed.
Yeah.
And we were able to co-construct it.
Yeah.
So this idea of a JOB being part of a vocation. And I think that continues to be my connection to the Leadership Brainery, is that we are not just working with young people who may not have seen those doors open to them, that what we're saying to them is you do belong, that there is a place for you here, but that we also want to help you be prepared. We want you to be able to navigate. And so I went through and we were able to weave equity through all the different aspects of the Brainery. It allowed to open your position to come in, Dana. I'm so excited to have been in, I feel now, numerous conversations with you. When you meet someone and you feel like you go a lot further back than just a few months, you're definitely one of those people for me. And that's Ohana. In Hawaii, we say, I'm from the island of Hawaii. I was raised by 3 incredible great grandmothers and the rest of my extended family. And learning about my history was incredibly important because I learned mostly from them, not from the books in school. And so I'm excited for this conversation. I have, I'm now the co-chair of the board of directors.
Yes, do you hear me? Yes.
With the honored, Claudia Henderson, and I'm excited. We have a very dynamic board. And so to have gone from a higher ed partner to a staff person to the co-chair of the board, I feel I have this unique vantage point to continue to support the Brainery, to be in this incredibly critical conversation about what is it that we want you to know about us, but also in what ways does critical race theory have a place in our curriculum, in our framework, in who we are, and at the same time, where does it not? And so I now am the founder and director of Catherine Wong Consults, which is an education, research, and training consulting firm, with the idea of how do I bring my K through 12 through higher ed experience in a way that continues to benefit young people, particularly BIPOC.
That's so amazing, so important, and is why we remain inspired and energized by you. You're someone who keeps doing the work, right? Hasn't given up on giving the work. And I feel as many of us are trying to reconcile our experiences with racism, that we get a bit hopeless, nihilistic, it gets tiring. Even the conversation that we're having today, about critical race theory and about if it's right or wrong, and that entire dynamic for people of color and for people who are marginalized and minoritized in these systems, it's exhausting to even have to defend or even speak to, things that attempt to humanize us, and certainly shed light on our experience navigating these systems. And so, with that, I think there's no one better to be sitting down with, having this conversation about, with grace, with intentionality, and certainly with a heart toward greater understanding and solidarity across our varying backgrounds and differences. And so thank you for being here today, Catherine.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much.
Do you hear her? Do you hear him?
We hear it.
Okay,
We hear you.
This is it. And so I think that is a perfect segue to start the conversation. And Jonathan, I think you're an amazing person to kind of address what is critical race theory? And how does that intertwine with your background and your experience and your education? There's so much misconstruement and lack of understanding, and we don't have to have the perfect answer at all, but just a general framework of what we're discussing today.
Yeah, I think that's important. Thank you for framing that, because I definitely don't seek to give the perfect answer. I think that as we have this conversation, and all conversations, we must be open to learning and understanding each other more and more and more and more. And this is what the intent of this conversation is, to unpack a bit what people are discussing, what people are in many ways have been discussing for decades, and some people are just now beginning to have the conversation.
Exactly.
And so we understand that people are on a spectrum as it relates to their understanding of critical race theory, as it relates to their understanding of race, as it relates to their understanding of humanity, of dignity and respect. People are on a spectrum.
Understand that themselves.
Understanding of
Yeah.
themselves, right? And I think that this is a lot of what everything is about. You know, I tell people all the time that systems don't run themselves. People run systems. Systems don't
Yes.
create themselves. People create systems.
Exactly.
And because people are at the helm of systems, it is that context that is driving everything. Their interpretation of things, which is influenced by their social context, where they grew up, who raised them, what resources they had as they were growing up, what they were made to believe about who they were, and their place and role in society. All of that context is navigating the way that we influencing the way that we navigate life. And so in terms of a definition of what critical race theory means, I think is important, and I want to kind of read verbatim and pull from the insights of the American Bar Association, but particularly Kimberly Crenshaw, who is known to have coined critical race theory. And in this particular article by Janelle George, from the American Bar Association, critical race theory is not diversity and inclusion training, but a practice of interrogating the role of race and racism in society that emerged in legal academy and spread to other fields of scholarship. You know, so that's the breeding ground, very much so a legal theory. And so Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term critical race theory, notes that CRT is not a noun, but a verb. It cannot be confined. Do you hear me? Yes. It is not a noun, it's a verb. It cannot be confined to a static and narrow definition, but is considered to be an evolving and malleable practice. It is a, do you hear me, practice.
Yes.
It critiques how the social construction of race and institutionalized racism perpetuate a racial caste system that regulates people of color to the bottom tiers. Critical race theory also recognizes that race intersects with other identities, including sexuality, gender identity, and others. Critical race theory recognizes that racism is not a bygone relic of the past. Instead, it acknowledges that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and the imposition of second-class citizenship on Black Americans and other people of color continue to permeate the social fabric of this nation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was so important.
So important framing.
Yeah.
And I think important for those of you who are consuming and engaging in this conversation online, in your homes, in your places of employment, you know, that you sit on that framing of critical race theory.
You know, it's interesting because a metaphor that comes to me as I hear you read that, Jonathan, and I think, you know, starting off when Dana and I were planning this, right? Like, it's really important to have a clear definition, and who better to give that definition but Kimberly Crenshaw,
Yes.
who herself is a legal scholar.
Yes.
So in terms of really placing and framing, but the metaphor that I think in metaphors at times, as you all know, is Victor Lewis, who is a dear friend, said at a presentation years ago, he said, we're all on the same boat, but we're on different decks. And when there's a hole in the bottom of the boat, who knows more about the hole?
Then you at the bottom of the ship.
The captain at the top or the folks at the bottom of the ship?
Do you hear me?
Do you hear me? And when I was teaching, when he posed that metaphor, I immediately took it back to my class. I was teaching graduate students at the time, and we actually constructed a boat. And we talked about the different roles, and we actually placed I created the room of chairs, right? But we then figured out who could have conversations with who. And so when we think that when you're using that definition, the question becomes, so what are we really talking about? When critical race continues to come up in conversation, it's exactly what we were saying a few minutes ago, that it's not about an either or. It's not about a right and wrong. That, as Kimberly says, right, it's an action word. It's the way that we move in the world, but it's not meant to sort of point a finger or say, I'm doing this because I want you to feel bad. That is nowhere in the construct.
Right. And that's so important because I feel like many people who I have heard, in arguments against or attacks on critical race theory, oftentimes have stemmed from a feeling of retaliation.
Yes.
Or one even trying to either justify or explain away or get rid of grief or guilt, rather, get rid of guilt and blame. And so I think it's important as Catherine just mentioned, that we make it very clear that our intentions here today are not to blame anybody, make anybody feel bad. I do believe in conviction, and I do believe that people should be convicted by not only their own actions, but ways in which they might be complicit in a system and in a society that causes others to have their backs up against the wall or to be at the bottom of the ship, for sure. And so if that is you, as we have this conversation and as you reflect on critical race theory, if you're one of those people who you feel as if your reactions are because of or aligned with you feeling some type of contention with blame and guilt, I think you should acknowledge that, notice that, and you should sit with that, and you should unpack that, and really ask yourself, where's that feeling coming from, and what additional conversations do you need to have with yourself, with history, with your family, with your friends, with society, to better inform how we move forward.
And I would say we're not blaming anybody in this conversation. Really just honing in on the systemic challenges that we've been facing for centuries now. And how do we unpack that without feeling blame? How do we address that without feeling at fault for that, right? And so let's jump into the first question. And I believe it's for you, Catherine. So, actually, I want to jump into a question a little more below that says, when did we first realize that critical race theory was a thing? When did you first hear about it, Catherine? And what was that experience like for you?
I think I first heard about it as I was going through my own research, as I was thinking about, how do I prepare graduate students, particularly in the Donovan program, when I was looking to bring in a cohort of predominantly BIPOC, first gen, believing sincerely that our young people need to see themselves reflected in the classroom. They need to see that being a teacher is a possibility. We're not going to diversify systems if we don't actually create the career pathways to do that. And so as I was doing my own research about, what kinds of frameworks can I bring in? How do I create both support and critical thinkers to go out into the teaching force and not just have it be about content, but how do young people see themselves in their curriculum? That I came up along Kimberly Crenshaw's research. And I didn't sort of take it verbatim, right? Like I looked at what was of value. And one of the things that was of value was this idea of intersectionality, that we are part of a power differential, that there is sort of places where we all have privilege and places where we don't. And it's not about this idea of feeling bad, it's really about seeking opportunity. And I think that, with Kimberly saying that, yes, this is about an action, this is about that it opens this door for opportunity, that for me, conflict does not necessarily need to be a precursor to war, but really about a place of transformation. And so for intersectionality, it was being able to talk to students around and organizations, how do we own what our power is and how do we share it? So the idea is that all four of us sitting around this table right now have education privilege. we have different experiences of not having race privilege. And that there's a level of contradiction in terms of, as I was learning about CRT and as it sort of became this thing, particularly in the last few months, of that there's now a contradiction where, as an Asian American woman, Pacific Islander, that I am both visible and invisible, right? That there's this hyper visibility of anti-Asian racism. For me, it's not, an incident, it's about racism. And at the same time, I also can be invisibilized. And so how do I move forward with those contradictions in a way that allow me to work with young people, to work in a way that it's a both and, that the modern minority has framed those contradictions, but so we can move past them. And so, what we've been told we can't do becomes what we say we can do. And I think that that's what, this idea of it, yes, it's a thing, but it also can be a place of transformation. It can be a way of shifting up to a counter narrative.
Yeah, that's so important. And one thing that I reflect on is one of the additional points that this article that I'm referencing throughout the conversation mentioned was that critical race theory does not define racism in the traditional manner as solely the consequence of discrete, irrational bad acts perpetuated by individuals, but is also and usually the unintended but often foreseeable consequences of choices. And that we are dealing with essentially a system that the consequences of which, the experiences that people have in it, are inputs that were made a long time ago. Not always current actions that are intended to suppress or oppress people, but understanding that choices that we make even decades and centuries ago, that they have modern implications, that they have modern impact and desperate impact, in fact. And so much of what we even see today in our society is a byproduct of past actions, past institutionalization. Slavery was a thing in the form that it was, particularly chattel slavery, for example, was a thing within a particular era that unfortunately is still having dynamic implications and impact today. And so Derek, can you speak a little bit to what is racism? I think that's important as we have this conversation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I typically have a formal definition, but I'll just give an overview of my experience, what racism means to me from a systemic perspective. And that is systems and laws set up intentionally to disproportionately affect people of color. And that goes all the way back to what you mentioned earlier, too, with individuals being involved in making these laws and these structures. And so when we talk about critical race theory, the argument is, well, racism is an individual thing, it's not a systemic thing. But then who makes systems at the end of the day? And so we have to be willing to address ourselves internally, our individual behaviors, our individual thoughts. Like you just said, Catherine, being able to have this spotlight on you, but be invisible at the same time. Obviously, we're not invisible. Every time we walk in the room, like Dana, you like to say, taking up space. All the thoughts that are going through our head when we see folks of different colors, different sexualities, and all these different things, we need to address that with ourselves. And that's why I really appreciate Dr. Kendi's thoughts around anti-racism, because I feel like we all have a responsibility to address our thoughts and our actions. Every single thing that we do as Americans is embedded in racism at the end of the day. Our country was built off chattel slavery. We can't run away from that. We can't not talk about that, right? 400 years ago, all the way up into now, when we talk about mass incarceration, people are chained up, locked up, forced to do work.
Yeah.
If we don't talk about that and note that that is wrong, we'll never progress in this idea that racism is not holding a huge subset, not even of a group of people, all of us back. You know, if we fix this issue, all of us benefit. And that's what kind of like irritates me a bit, because, you know, I feel like a lot of people want to make it seem like if we address racism, I'm doing a favor for people of color.
Yeah.
Which it benefits us all to have greater prosperity, diversity at the table, different perspectives. That's innovation. That's how we come up with new ideas. Even when we think about who we say is on the other spectrum, white folks are not a monolithic group either.
No.
You know, in America, white folks come from all different areas and have been systemically oppressed by each other a lot of times too. And we address those things. And I feel like a lot of white people acknowledge that. And so now it's time to really acknowledge also the systemic oppression of people of color in this country.
I really appreciate you naming so many things, so many, the definitions, the frameworks. And I think that that's one of the most important parts that I hope people are walking away from this episode is do your research, have context, have understandings for references, because we cannot just go out into the world spewing whatever we feel because it riles up our emotions. Where are the facts and the context? And just pulling it back to the original question, what was my introduction to critical race theory it wasn't until I served with AmeriCorps for 2 years in Washington, D.C., Southeast to be exact. And that's when I started watching things like 13 and talking about incarceration and talking about the education system, prison to pipeline. It wasn't until I left my own home that I understood the differences and how these things were just so systematic, as we've heard that word so many times in this conversation. And once I was able to have that framework, like, this is bigger than me. And sometimes I feel like, I will say, I feel like my AmeriCorps year felt like a little bit of a Band-Aid. I knew I was gonna leave my students. I knew that I couldn't be a teacher in the next 2 years. It wasn't gonna make the difference. But it was an introduction that myself, my peers, white, Black, Asian, it didn't matter who we were, we all needed to have these conversations. And we watched segments of 13th as a group of a 200-person corps and just had conversations in breakout groups. So we were getting all this really fast information, but not processing. So I left my core years feeling very heavy, feeling like if my next job didn't make me address the world's issues, I was doing it wrong. And I had to then come to terms with, I'm doing my part by educating myself, by having these conversations with people who are uncomfortable with them and providing that space for them. So that's, I think the more, I'm not saying you're going to go do AmeriCorps, but I think the more that there's space and place for these conversations, the more likely that the first time someone hears critical race theory, it's not with their back against the wall, feeling like they need to be very agitated, like we said earlier. It's more so like, well, let me inquire a little bit more.
Exactly. And I just want to say that I think, you know, as I reflect on some of my initial introduction to critical race theory, you know, it was in theology school, but as a formal term, you know, I took critical race theory in law school when I went to Boston University School of Law, and almost had the opportunity to take it with Dr. Kiara Bridges, but she left before it was time, but who is an incredible scholar.
If you don't know Professor Bridges, you should definitely go look her up.
You should definitely look her up, and I'm gonna reference her a bit. She's also quoted in this this article that I'm referencing for everybody. But just as people begin to unpack and try and learn more about critical race theory, I just wanted to note a few of the originators of critical race theory. We've mentioned Kimberly Crenshaw. Derek Bell is also one of the originators, Cheryl Harris, Richard Delgado, Patricia Williams, Gloria Ladson Billings, Tara Yoso, and several others. And, you know, through my time in critical race theory, in addition to talking about certainly the Black American experience, I was enlightened to the Latinx experience, enlightened to critical race theory being thought through the lens of gender and sexuality as well. And even conversations premised on rights, which is another important conversation as it relates to critical race theory, because a lot of the arguments and underpinnings is about rights and what rights do people have. And do they have a right to liberty? Do they have a right to freedom? Do they have a right to certain essentials and necessities in life that we unpack when we're thinking about race and racism? And so those are some of the conversations that you will explore as you go and do your own research on critical race theory and check out some of these people that I just mentioned.
You know, what I think is so important as I continue to listen is this idea of critical, right? Because what do we mean when we say critical? We're looking at being able to look past just the question itself. And I think for me, at the end of the day, what is it that we want to learn? What is it that we want our young people to be prepared for? Do we want them prepared to work in a global workforce? Rhetorical question. My answer is yes.
Yes, exactly.
Right? And so if we want them to be best prepared to work in a global workforce, then what is education about? Is it about making someone just really comfortable all the time? Or is it encouraging critical thinking?
Yeah.
Is it about complacency? Or is it about having the courage to step up and step out when you see injustice?
Yeah.
Is it about creating disconnection? Or is it about cultivating connection? And I think, again, why having this conversation at the Leadership Brainery is because we want a different type of educational experience.
Yeah.
And that CRT has provided a framework, but it isn't the answer. And I think part of what we're doing in this conversation is putting those questions out, because it's not about having the perfect answer. It's about being critical in the way that we're asking questions. You know, when I think about when you came to keynote our college roundtable for College Bound, and we had close to 99% of the 80+ students in the room, 7th through 12th graders, were BIPOC students, and they hung on every word of your story because they could see themselves being resonated in what it meant to be first gen, what it meant to go to undergrad. You know, I often say we walk in rooms and we do an environmental scan. It's the research of Mellom. And in the work of Tara Yosa, are we developing community cultural wealth? Or are we always feeling like an only? Because when you're always feeling like an only, it's not that you have imposter syndrome, it's the system places imposter syndrome on you.
Exactly.
Do you hear me?
Do you hear me?
And so I think that, you know, as I think about the Dunman scholars that have gone out into classrooms and have gone on to become teachers of the year, who may have struggled in undergrad and grad school, but who stepped up because they wanted young people to see them as a role model. They wanted young people to see themselves in the literature. They created classroom libraries of multicultural authors so that young people could see themselves thriving. So as Tara Yosa puts it, it's about developing that community cultural wealth that isn't about a right and wrong. It's about feeling represented. It's about, as Lee Patel would say, it's about the verb of mattering. That matter is not, again, just a noun. It's a verb. It's about being in a world where mattering is happening all around you.
Yeah, it is.
Go ahead, Dana.
I was gonna say, I think I can acknowledge that my experience is a little bit different, but it's so important to reflect on what did your upbringing in classrooms look like? What was being taught to you? Why wasn't it until, it wasn't for me at least, it wasn't until I went to DC, because I did go to Prospect Hill Academy. That is a charter school where most of my teachers may not have reflected me, but they made sure that my literature did. Edwidge Danticat, Toni Morrison, all these people, Langston Hughes, I was reading Native Son in like 6th grade. And so it wasn't until I got to college in DC, I said, well, why don't you think this thought? And I think that's encouraging more conversation, making sure people feel equipped to have these conversations comfortably. And I know I cut you off.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point, Dana. And I would say, me and Jonathan, we have this conversation all the time, because my upbringing, especially K through 12, I don't remember us ever talking about race. Grew up in Missouri, which you all know Missouri has a lot of challenges. But Jonathan had a different upbringing. Like he would say in the classroom how they would talk about different Black historians and movements and so forth. And so I went to a HBCU, both Jonathan and I did, Grambling State University, where everybody is somebody.
Do you hear me?
Do you hear me?
Do you hear me? And I would say I learned a lot at Grambling about not only myself, but then Black culture and all the different type of Black folks in their history and their perspectives, and that was really helpful for me. Then I went to Tufts School of Medicine for my master's in public health. And we're going through a pandemic right now, so these disparities are very front and center. We see them. They're all systemic in nature, and I do want to talk about that in a second. But I was the only Black man to come to my cohort at Tufts School of Med for public health, and I had one Black professor, Dr. Linda Hudson, and she challenged me, and I appreciated that. And I was doing one project, and she had told me, public health is about looking all the way upstream. Like we have to go all the way upstream. We see what's at the waterfall, what's falling down, all of these disparities, and we go halfway up the stream, you still won't get to the root cause. You got to see where's the water coming from that all these people and all these things are falling. And so every time I would look all the way upstream with the disparities in our society, rather that is around healthcare, wealth gaps, education access, it will always lead back to race and racism in this country. And so then I started focusing on racism as a public health issue, and it was still very taboo. People were just like, well, racism is not a public health issue. Like we shouldn't be talking about racism when we're talking about infectious disease and healthcare access. And I really pushed and challenged a lot of my professors in that regard to say, if we are really going to continue to talk about disparities in our country, in our neighborhoods, why in Boston, Dorchester, and Roxbury look extremely different than Back Bay, in Brighton, and Austin?
Yes.
It's not just because people have decided to live there and people live different ways because of their culture, but it is because of redlining. And why do we have food deserts, for example? It is because of redlining, and food deserts lead to lower life expectancies, health disparities, and all of these different things that we know are system-based. Someone is not just there saying, I want all of Dorchester to be a food desert. Over time, this has happened because of the systems were in place, and then the people that are in there that are holding up the systems. And so
intentionally and unintentionally.
Exactly. So we have to be anti-racist to put a lens on everything that we're doing and saying, who could this possibly be affecting? Who's at the bottom of the ship on all the things that we're doing? What are they saying? And I think that's really important, because oftentimes when it comes to issues, we don't want to believe the victim.
Yes.
And how don't we believe the folks who are saying, I'm feeling like this. This is what I'm going through. My family doesn't have any money and we're not getting access to opportunity. But then other folks want to say, you are getting opportunity, you're not taking advantage, but you're not the one giving me the opportunity. You're not giving me the opportunity. And so I think one thing that we have to continue to do is look all the way upstream. When we see an issue, keep going and say, what could possibly be causing this issue? But then also really listen to people. I think if we took more time to really listen to each other, do more conversations like these, do you hear me? And just really unpack our feelings and our experiences, we can learn a lot about each other.
Well, I think it's also about, teaching doesn't just happen in the classroom. And so the idea of, intergenerational community learning. And when I think about, how did I learn about my culture? How did I learn that I was Chinese? How did I learn that there is a Hawaiian history within my lineage? And it was actually from my grandfather, my gungong. And so he supplemented my education, because I would go running up the hill from school and say, we're learning about this. And he would basically talk about his entire life story as he was yelling at the television news, right? But he would talk about, he was a physician that was called to Pearl Harbor when it was bombed. But he did house calls as the norm, even though my grandmother would be like, why don't they just come to your office? And he said, they don't have the means and I do, so I'm gonna go to them. And he would at times barter his fees. So he came home with breadfruit instead of, his monetary fee. And that influenced who I became. But it took until grad school, meeting Patricia Arredondo, a Latina professor. My first professor of color was in graduate school, and going through that whole cross-cultural counseling training really opened up for me what it meant to value my culture and to have young people be able to step into their own ownness of who they are and that they deserve to be represented in education. And so I know I owe a great deal of thanks to her in the same way that you talk about, Derek, that professors do have the capacity to change our lives. But I also saw myself reflected in her story.
What's so important, because I'm in grad school now, part-time, and I have not had a professor to reflect me up until this point. And
do you hear me?
and it does hurt. And there's actually one class that I'm fighting to get in it, and I want it so bad. It's about operations and technology and how powerful to be taught by a Black woman. I would love to be a part of that. Do you hear me?
Do you hear me? Who is professor?
Right. And so I say that to say, I just want to also move us to this next question is, what is the impact of anti-CRT policy and sentiment in the classrooms and in academia, and how that it impacts our graduate students and the population that we're working with? So often they're coming to us because they're looking for a community in the clubhouse. They're looking for us to hold space for them, because when they go into their classrooms, when they're walking on campus, it does not reflect them. And so for more than just the schools, how are our students operating? I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts.
I think social isolation is incredibly powerful. And so if you're not sort of feeling, I think that it's brilliant that there is a clubhouse here so that young people can sort of leave their institutions, meet other BIPOC students from other institutions. But I also think that those settings can also happen within the institutions themselves. That, I often say that recruitment and retention need to be part of the same sentence, that they're not sort of two different entities, that they're interrelated, that if you're just recruiting, then you're just doing the window dressing. You have to figure out what's inside the house, what is holding up the walls. And so this idea that these anti-CRT movements continue to push our young people away from education. They continue to see, it as a negative experience with toxic energy. Are they going to actually apply? And what we are seeing is we're seeing lower numbers of students enrolling in college. And if we go back and look at the statistics, there are going to be students who either feel that they don't have the means, and not just means in terms of monetary wealth, that is certainly important, but they're also not seeing themselves represented. They're not seeing a particular calling. I think that for folks that I talk to, it's this idea that we're just not wanting a job. We want a place where there's going to be this sense of belonging, this sense of purpose. And so I think that, it behooves us to have this conversation so that organizations and schools are creating environments where our young people feel welcome, where they feel belonged, where they can go through 4 years, or they can go through another 3 years of graduate school and feel that there will be a place for them both in the school, but also in the workforce. And I know it's a whole nother conversation, right? But how do we go from graduate school into a career trajectory where you do feel that you matter and that you can make a difference for the next generation that comes up behind you?
That's so key. And Catherine, I'm gonna ask you another question off of that, but more so K through 12. And so there's these arguments that CRT should not be taught if it is being taught in K through 12. And how do you think that's affecting students and young people even before they get to college and graduate school?
I think we talk about, it's the cradle cradle to career, pipeline, and this idea of, CRT is not being taught as a formal content subject in K through 12. And as you quoted early on, CRT is not about diversity, equity, and belonging education either. But if we go back to Tara Yosa's framework around community cultural wealth, about young people's lived experiences, being part of literature, being part of word problems. And the idea is that the more we leave out, the less young people are going to feel seen.
Mhm.
And when we talk about K through 12, we want young people to not just feel they have to survive in school.
Mhm.
We want them to thrive.
Exactly.
And this idea of preparing, I do teacher prep, right? So it's this idea of preparing teachers to be inclusive, to
Right.
think not just about equality, but to think with an equity lens. How am I looking out at my entire class? Who am I calling on when? Are we doing sort of peer leadership? Are young people seeing leadership early on in their K to 12 experience? Coming back to the Leadership Brainery, how are we populating our policy tables? Well, we need to start younger, right?
Exactly.
We need young people to envision themselves in all types of careers because they see it as a possibility.
Yeah.
And I think that that's why it's critical to say, education is not just about book education.
Exactly.
It's about life navigation. And it's about blending both. I'm not saying content knowledge is not important. It's hugely important, but also it's teaching life skills.
Right.
It's
So true.
teaching young people to feel that their authentic selves belong in a classroom.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And even for the context of this conversation, I want to note that young people or young is subjective.
Absolutely.
And it's, we're certainly talking about potentiality here.
Yes.
As opposed to a finite point in time in one's life or journey. Because more and more we're hearing from graduate schools that they're wanting people who have work experience.
Yes.
And so as you think about that, more and more Leadership Brainery is beginning to hone in on energizing working professionals who desire to go back to graduate school to level up and to experience greater career mobility. And so certainly take the notion of young as you will, for sure. And if it inspires you to go back to graduate school, let's make it happen.
Do you hear me?
Do you hear me?
Young in spirit.
Yes, but for sure. I think it's really important. And I think just even as we even move this conversation forward and really reflect on the premise of America and our own Constitution, our own history, America being founded from people who came over from England and were saying that they were trying to run away from the monarch, trying to run away from what they considered to be oppressive rule, and came to this land, inhabited it, colonized it for sure, killed up a whole bunch of people, native, indigenous people, in fact, to create a place that they inspired toward freedom, toward liberty, toward posterity and tranquility. And that same thinking, as we look at the Bill of Rights, as we look at the Constitution, is said to kind of reinforce those goals,
Right.
those ideals. Friends, that's a form of critical theory,
Yes.
right? That's a form of critical theory. And those who are doing critical race theory, as Derek mentioned earlier, critical race theory, as is the case with any theory, is a lens in which to look at something, in which to examine and analyze something. And it's intended to bring voice and attention to an identity or an experience that may or may not be prioritized in conversations. And that's what the critical race theory is trying to do. It is trying to give voice and lens and perspective to a piece of our population that is valuable as the rest, that is as significant as the rest, as important as the rest, as human as the rest. And it calls upon us to say, how is this particular circumstance influenced by race?
Yes.
Right, that's what it's asking us to do. The answer is a totally different ballgame. What answer you come to. But the question is what critical race theory beckons us to ask ourselves when we look at varying circumstances and experiences in our country. And it really tries to hone in on systems, in fact.
And the history of systems.
And the histories of systems. And how those systems have been codified, calibrated,
Yes.
in fact, to function and behave a certain way. And sometimes those systems are lacking certain resources to make them more equitable,
Because
to make them more fair.
who gets served by the systems and who does not.
Exactly. That's the outcome of our reflection when we factor in race. Because when we factor in race, we can't factor in race without asking ourselves and factoring in 400 years of existence in this country. And you can't unpack race without doing that.
Right.
You can't erase all of that and try to reflect on race in the vacuum of 2022. That's impossible. And that's disingenuous. And we should be unpacking the context of race with the insight of history, as truthful, as raw as it is, as unfortunate as it is, and really make a commitment to one another, that we see each other, that we care, and that we indeed want to ensure that our journeying in this society is one that allows all of us to thrive and not merely survive.
Well, I think what's so important is you cannot have a critical conversation about race without having a critical conversation about power.
Yeah.
And that,
Do you hear me?
whew,
Yes, do you hear me?
and that power in and of itself can be shared.
It can
Yes.
be.
That, I would often say to students, and you're right, that, age becomes relative, that
Mhm.
we can enter education. Again, education is not just the four walls of a classroom, but this idea of being able to step into who you really are
Right.
and being able to say, I'm here. And that I am willing to share power, that, creating a collective, say, leadership model doesn't stop somebody from being an executive director.
Exactly.
Creating a way that I'm learning from students and they're learning from me doesn't take away the fact that I'm the director.
Mhm.
So being vulnerable doesn't necessarily need to negate authority.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And in fact, we should be recalibrating our system to have shared prosperity,
Yes.
shared power, and that will allow us to experience shared progression.
Well, that's what generational wealth
It's all
is
about.
all
Yeah.
about.
It's all about, and they're not, in the words of Shagun, our chief of economic opportunity and inclusion here at Boston, that we cannot and should not confuse movement with progress.
You hear me?
Right? Do you hear me? Let's not
Do you hear me?
confuse movement with progress, and be committed to really creating progress, and not just motion, not just movement, that is couched in the facade of progress. Real progress requires that we be a bit uncomfortable,
Right.
Yes.
that we deal with things that make us feel embarrassed at times, not necessarily only about our own actions, but about the actions of our ancestors. And as well as causing us to be even more committed, to unpacking those things and working through them and becoming better and better and better each day.
Yes, and I'm not.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, and I hope I'm not going backwards at all, but I just wanted to reiterate my view on how racism is systemic. And when we think about Jim Crow laws, or we think about being 3/5 of a man and so forth, all of those things were embedded in our laws.
Mhm.
Yes.
And the fact that we're even having this conversation around critical race theory, and that legislators are passing laws to ban us talking about racism, means that racism is systemic. We
Right.
should not be talking about creating laws to stop talking about racism if racism should not be about laws. right?
Right.
Um,
Do you hear
Hear
me?
me?
Do you hear me?
Right. So I just wanted to reiterate that a bit because I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And as we get ready to wrap up shortly, I just want to note what Kiera Bridges highlights regarding critical race theory, and says that one important thing for people to understand is that the rejection of popular understandings about racism, such as arguments that confine racism to a few bad apples, and that critical race theory recognizes that racism is codified in law, embedded in structures, and woven into public policy. Critical race theory rejects claims of meritocracy or colorblindedness.
Yes.
And critical race theory recognizes that it is the systemic nature of racism that bears primary responsibility for producing racial inequality.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is critical race theory. That is how you do this. That is how you have this conversation. Every single person at this table has a different experience, has a different context,
Yes.
and brings so much to the conversation, because every single's opinion and perspective is important for a better understanding. And that's all we want to encourage. That's literally, when you're analyzing the theory, that is how you get critical. Everyone kind of touched on that, actually.
Yes.
Everyone said it's just,
Mhm.
are we really thinking about the full question?
Right.
Are we looking upstream?
Mhm.
Are we looking at the systems and the structures? There's no accusation. There's no right or wrong. And so we really want to make sure that you're walking away with a few tools before we close out this conversation, so that you feel more empowered in your everyday life to have these conversations with your peers, with your professors, at your institutions, at your jobs, wherever you are at your stage in life. I really like that. Let's not confuse movement with progress. I feel like that touched my soul a little bit. Like, we're not telling you to do anything in one way or another, but just do what feels right for you and wherever this conversation feels applicable.
Yes.
And so we now have a greater understanding of what CRT is, by definition, by framework, by legal theory. I hope that you're all walking away with that.
Yes.
And again, I just want to reiterate, I hope that wherever you are in this world, you are feeling more equipped to ask questions, to talk to your professors, to talk with leadership and people who may feel a little bit more uncomfortable to have the conversations with, so that their backs aren't against the wall. But reaching out, and we talked about DEI, DEIB, and what that means. And that's another buzzword that typically will go alongside critical race theory. But we want to be clear that diversity, equity, inclusion, and the reason why we're adding B is for belonging, so that everyone feels like they belong at every stage and level of that boat. So if they so choose to move throughout it, and do your research. There have been so many authors, frameworks been mentioned, that if you just pick any one of these, you will be in a better place than you were yesterday.
Yes, indeed. You hear me?
And so I'd love to pass this off to Catherine, because you have some amazing points that I need to make sure that people hear.
You know, what I think has been so powerful about the Leadership Brainery is that we have formed a group of member institutions, both at employers and higher ed, because the idea is no one of us knows everything. And part of all that's happening is, how do we come in solidarity? How do we share knowledge, skills, and expertise? And that by forming these sort of higher ed and employee partnerships, there's a couple questions that I would sort of pose going forward as you've listened to this conversation. You've heard 4 viewpoints that converged at times, were different at times, but that's what a conversation about CRT, about race is about. It's about bringing our authentic selves and purpose to a conversation. And so as an institution, as an organization, you know, what is your diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives? Do you have any? Do you know what they are? And how would you hold yourself accountable to them as a professional, whether it be if you're at a director level, if you're at a staff level? How do you manage up? How do you manage down? In what ways do you create an inclusive environment where even those that are newly hired, you're hiring in the middle of a pandemic, some of you may have never met who you're hiring or who you're bringing to campus just yet, or you're just meeting them for the first time after 6 months or a year. What kinds of environments are you creating for them?
You know, and I would just say, if you haven't already, go check out our last episode on mental health and access to therapy. It was absolutely incredible. We talked about a lot of similar things in this conversation around the systemic barriers that lead us to access to therapy, so we can have good mental stability, health.
Yes.
And make sure you follow us on social media at Leadership Brainery. Keep up with us. We have critical conversations every month. We have events every month. We have programming that can help you access graduate school. So you definitely want to keep tapped in. All right.
Thank you so much.
It has been truly an honor.
Yes.
Oh my
Thank
goodness,
you.
and always an honor. We're so grateful for you, for your leadership,
Yes, thank you.
for your grace, and so excited about all that is to come. Certainly, now that you have taken the helms as co-chair of the Leadership Brainery Board of Directors, we know that the best is yet to come.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. All right, everybody, continue to make it happen out there. Make change for the greater good. Do you hear me?
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Do you hear me? Yes,
Until
indeed.
next time.
Indeed. All right, one more last thing. I know we already just did, but Catherine Wong consults. If you are looking for someone to bring into your institution, into your company, to help you think about and create frameworks for some of these critical things that we spoke about today and beyond, make sure you all check out Catherine Wong Consults.
Yes.
We'll be able to put her email in the information so you can reach out. All right.
Yes, so y'all
Thank
make sure
you.
y'all stay in touch, make it happen, and listen, have a great day. And as I heard somebody recently say, so I want to say it to you, if you're not having a bad day, a good day, then don't go make nobody else day bad because you're having a bad day. So-
Do you?
Do you hear me?
Awesome, awesome.
Take care.